All right, ladies and gentlemen, you are locked on Falcons. I'm your host, Aaron Freeman, and today we're talking about whether Matt Ryan has fallen off. Will one of the top pass rushers in the draft slide to the Falcons at 8? And should the Falcons be worried about reaching in the top of the first round in this 2022 draft?
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
So, guys, you know me. I'm Aaron Freeman, been covering the Falcons for many years, formerly at FalcFans.com, RIP. Still going strong on Twitter at FalcFans. Also, the host of this world-renowned Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, right here on the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And of course, today's episode is a Q&A where I'll be sharing you my Wednesday wisdom on this world-renowned podcast. We'll be answering a bunch of listener questions, including whether or not Matt Ryan's fallen off, will one of the top pass rushers slide, how much patience Arthur Blank will have for this Arthur Smith regime, and then we'll, of course, be revisiting the topic of, whether people spend too much time worrying about who the Falcons will wind up taking and whether or not there's really a such thing as a reach for the Falcons at the top of the first round. So we'll get into all of that later on the episode. But before we get into that, I do want to thank you guys for making Locked On Falcons your first listen each and every day. Of course, Locked On Falcons is free and available on the same podcast, all the podcast platforms that you can find your favorite podcasts, including Apple, Odyssey, Google, and Spotify. And of course, now Locked On Falcons is free and available on YouTube. So make sure you subscribe to the Locked On Falcons YouTube channel and give us a like when you do. So our first question comes from Ben S. He asks, question, if we gave Matt Ryan the help that he had in 2016, would we get a similar result in terms of production that we got in 2016? Or has he lost some abilities that would not allow him to be on that level anymore? I often hear people say that Matt Ryan has passed his prime. I'm wondering what that means. Obviously, his production has decreased since 2016, but as a TV-only football watcher, no film, I haven't noticed any of his physical skills drop off, arm strength, and mobility. Have any of his physical and mental abilities left him in his aging years? I love listening every day. Thank you, Ben. If you're asking the question, if we took a time machine and went back to 2016 and kidnapped all that entire roster and brought them into 2022, would we see Matt Ryan produce at an MVP level? Would we see a comparable, historically great offense in this upcoming 2022 season? I would be very skeptical of that, because unless you're also kidnapping Kyle Shanahan, I don't necessarily know if it's going to work, right? Because we have already seen sort of what a team with very comparable talent going from 2016 to 2017, of course, minus Jacob Tamme and Patrick DeMarco and Aldrick Robinson, but pretty much the core pieces outside of DeMarco were still in place from 2016 and 2017. And we saw a significant drop off in the performance of the offense, even though Matt Ryan's performance arguably was comparable in both seasons. But you saw the overall offense drop off because the play calling wasn't there, because of the change from Kyle Shanahan and Steve Sarkisian. And this is part of why I spent so much time during last season talking about Arthur Smith's play calling, because I feel like it's the elephant in the room that gets ignored, because the narrative is that the Falcons' only issue is talent and it has nothing to do with the play calling stuff. And I think, finding out whether or not Arthur Smith is a good play caller or not is going to be one of the important questions that we need to have answered by the end of 2022, because if he's not, then it doesn't really matter, in my humble opinion, what kind of talent that the Falcons add between, now and next year and beyond, because there's always going to be kind of a lower ceiling on this offense's potential. If Arthur Smith is just a guy, so to speak, as far as that. As for whether or not Matt Ryan is past his prime, the answer I think is yes, but the drop for him in terms of the mental and physical stuff that you're asking is not significant. It's not something that, you, the quote unquote layman TV only football watcher, is going to particularly pick up on, and again, I know this sounds a certain way to some folks listening or watching, but like as someone myself who's reviewed every throw that Matt Ryan's made over the last 13 seasons, has watched all of those throws on film, like I have a better feel for what Matt Ryan was, is, and will be. And so like it's a subtle drop off, but it's not anything major that would make me think, oh, like he's incapable. Like again, if you kidnapped that 2016 team and you brought in Kyle Shanahan, I wouldn't necessarily expect Matt Ryan to put up exactly the numbers that he did that 2016 season, but it would probably be pretty close to it. It would still be one of the better quarterback seasons we've ever seen, right? Maybe it's not the fourth best quarterback season we've ever seen. Maybe it's only the ninth best quarterback season we've ever seen, but that is still an MVP caliber type of season. You know what I'm saying? So, I don't think, despite saying that Matt Ryan is declining, I don't think he's done. I don't think he's washed. I think there's still plenty of good football in him. It's just going to be a question of whether this current regime is going to be able to get that out of him. And the clock is kind of ticking on when that is, because as I've been saying for almost now 6 months, I think if they can't do it this upcoming season, we're probably going to see the team move on. And again, I know some of you guys hate hearing me say this and, want to call me a hater or whatever you want to call me, but like there is just no precedent for an NFL team in modern times to quote unquote rebuild around a 38-year-old quarterback, which is what Matt Ryan's age will be in the 2023 season if he's still around here in Atlanta. So to me, unless the Falcons can make a significant push this upcoming season towards the playoffs at the very least, right? Whether they make the playoffs or not, but like at least be on the cusp of making the playoffs. And no, I don't think what they did in 2021 was on the cusp of making the playoffs. Yeah, technically they had a win total that kept them in the race through week 17, but we all knew that this team's chances of making the playoffs were extremely slim and pretty much evaporated the minute they lost to the 49ers. I mean, going into those games, you look at the various advanced metric websites and they were saying like the Falcons chances of making the playoffs were like 2%, 3%, less than 1%. So like, we kind of know what's up. So I think we'll have to see, this team be considerably better in 2022 in order for the team to continue justifying, going with Matt Ryan moving forward. But again, it's not because Matt Ryan's washed or done or is incapable of playing at a high level. It's just the situation here in Atlanta is not really conducive for the Falcons to continue down that path long term, in my humble opinion. So we'll just sort of see how it all plays out, and hopefully Matt Ryan will look like the player that he was, several years ago. Again, I don't think he's going to be 2016 or anything like that, but certainly, 2018 is possible. All right, it's possible. I wouldn't say it's likely, but it's possible. So we'll see how it all plays out. So that will leave it with that question, and we'll move on and talk a little bit about what will happen if one of the top draft prospects like a Kayvon Thibodeaux falls to the Falcons at pick number 8, and how much patience will owner Arthur Blank have for this Arthur Smith regime if they were to trade Matt Ryan this offseason. We'll get into all of that as we continue today's Locked On Falcons podcast, but I know some of you guys are sad because the football season is over. But don't worry, basketball season is in full swing. You got pro and college hoops going full swing, and you can find the latest odds, props, and totals, podcasts, scores, and more at betonline.net, the number one spot for all your sports betting needs. And it's not just basketball, it's hockey, boxing, UFC, Olympic coverage, Vegas casino games, and much, much more. So head to the website at betonline.net. Use your mobile device to learn more about the trends and the ongoing action at BetOnline, where the game starts. So our next question comes from Greg E. He says, "Hi, Aram. I am definitely one of those that makes Locked On Falcons my first listen for the day. I enjoy your opinions on our Atlanta Falcons. They're always insightful, informative, and sometimes provocative. Thanks for being part of my morning routine. Keep up the good work." Appreciate it, Greg. You've been a loyal supporter of the podcast for quite some time, so I appreciate those kind of words. Greg's question is, every year a player who was expected to go higher in the draft inexplicably drops down the board. In your order of preference, which of these 3 players would you like to see drop to us at number 8, and why? And he lists Kyle Hamilton, Ikem Ekwonu, and Kayvon Thibodeaux. Um, I know you guys hate when I say this, but to be honest with you, I don't really have a preference between those three players. And this kind of gets back to the thing that I've been kind of complaining about on the podcast for the last week or so, which is, I think we spend too much energy focused on who the first round pick is going to be and don't really talk about anything else this offseason. And kind of how I will feel about the Falcons' first round pick and in these three prospects in particular will be heavily dependent on what happens in March and free agency. For example, let's say Kayvon Thibodeaux, who is probably the guy of this three that I think is probably the most likely to fall to 8. We'll see. But Kayvon Thibodeaux is certainly a very talented player. If the Falcons were to draft him, he'd probably, certainly since I've been paying attention to the Falcons draft picks for 25 years, he'd be the most talented pass rusher that we have added to Atlanta in that time. But he's a very raw prospect, right? Kayvon Thibodeaux is a great athlete. And we'll see how great an athlete he is if he should decide to test at the combine next week. But he's a player that plays with no finesse, no technique. He has no pass rush moves. He's a guy that relies entirely off of his athleticism. And we've seen how that works for various pass rushers as they transition to the NFL. And so I would not expect Kayvon Thibodeaux to come in and be very productive in 2022 if the Falcons were to draft him as a pass rusher. And so because I put such an emphasis on the Falcons being able to upgrade their trench play and being able to upgrade their pass rush as part of that, and they have, to me, a real opportunity to do so this offseason, if all they do is add Kayvon Thibodeaux to their pass rush, then to me, I'm going to feel a little wanting, even though Kayvon Thibodeaux may be one of the 8 best players or one of the 3 or 4 best players in this draft class. So for me, Greg, it's kind of like, tell me who they're signing in free agency. Tell me who they're going to draft potentially later in the draft that's also going to add to their pass rush, to tell me before I can give you really what I feel about the idea of taking Kayvon Thibodeaux. And to a lesser extent, that also applies to Kyle Hamilton or Ikem Ekwonu, right? I need that sort of added context to be really give you a real clear opinion on one of these 3 guys. But as I said earlier, of these 3 guys, like right now, and we'll see how it changes again. We're still early in the process, but right now, I would be surprised if Kyle Hamilton or I would be right, more surprised, more surprised. Like I would be shocked if Kyle Hamilton falls to 8. I wouldn't be completely shocked if Ikem Ekwonu falls to 8. Although, like, to me, he would have to like bomb his combine at this point in time to see him slide. But Kayvon Thibodeaux is certainly a possibility because we've seen, Oregon prospects the last couple of years, Penny Sewell being knocked for sort of these sort of undisclosed maturity character issues or whatever the case may be. And people are going to ding Kayvon Thibodeaux because it's like he's a smart guy that has interests outside of football. And they're like, does he love football? And all the various narratives. But that'll be something that we'll talk about probably as this process plays out. So our next question comes from Joe Bear at Joe Bear 74. He asks, let's say they trade Ryan this year, pass on a quarterback in the draft, and take a couple of veteran quarterbacks. Do you think Arthur Blank would have the patience with letting this staff not try to win till 23 or 2024? Again, it kind of depends on what happens this upcoming season. How much patience Arthur Blank is going to have, I think, is going to be heavily dependent on how much progress this team shows in 2022. And to me, regardless of who the quarterback is, if the Falcons have that negative outcome that myself and others are potentially dreading this upcoming season, where facing a harder schedule, the weaknesses, the limitations of not only this roster, but this coaching staff are more exposed, and the team is again picking high in the 2023 draft, I think how much patience then Arthur Blank is going to have is going to be heavily dependent on what type of progress they show that year as well. And so hypothetically, if they were to trade, let's say, Matt Ryan and then go out there and sign someone like a Marcus Mariota to be their sort of new bridge quarterback, and they go 5-12 with Mariota, I don't think Arthur Blank's going to be particularly thrilled about that outcome and the overall direction of the team. They traded Matt Ryan and they took a step back. And that's going to put a lot more pressure on the team entering 2023. And even if they were to land, some superstar prospect at the quarterback position at the top of the 2023 draft, like a Bryce Young or CJ Stroud or whoever else is considered to be that rock star, unless that rookie comes in and pulls a Mac Jones and puts this team in playoff contention, I feel like there's a good chance that heads will still roll in 2024. And, I looked it up a couple of years ago. But like you look at the history of coaches getting fired the year after they use a number one pick on a quarterback, it's pretty high, right? The percentage, I think the number was like 70% of coaches of teams make coaching changes the year after they draft a quarterback in the first round. So we'll see how that goes. But it's hard to have any real confidence about any of these outcomes this year, next year, or whenever without knowing what the team looks like in 2022 or 2023. And I just have a hard time, and I've seen some people say otherwise, but like I just have a hard time believing Arthur Blank is going to be infinitely patient with this current regime like he was with the previous regime. I think the patience that he showed with Dan Quinn is not going to be automatically given to Arthur Smith and company, right? Like the reason why Dan Quinn was given that level of patience is because Dan Quinn went to a Super Bowl, right? Like that, people forget that. And if all Arthur Smith can show for is like a 7-10 season, like he's not going to get that level of patience. And when you look at the fact that the Falcons are currently in a 4-year playoff drought, this is the longest playoff drought that this franchise has been in since the late 80s. This is the longest of the Arthur Blank tenure. And so the idea that they could miss the playoffs for a 5th year and then potentially a 6th year, like I just don't see Arthur Blank being like, okay, that's cool. I don't see it. So, and then when you couple that with the idea of going back to the conversation that we had last January after we hired Arthur Smith and went through the reasons why Arthur Blank, some of the potential reasons at least that Arthur Blank went with Arthur Smith and Terry Fontenot over some of the other candidates. And one of the things we talked about was the idea that Arthur Blank wanted to run it back. That's why he was attracted to Arthur Smith, given his status as a offensive guru from the Kyle Shanahan coaching tree to get back what we lost, a couple of years ago, and also a guy that is known for resurrecting quarterbacks and getting Matt Ryan back on track, like he did with Ryan Tannehill and Terry Fontenot, coming from an organization in New Orleans that had navigated a tight salary cap situation. But despite, having that tight salary cap situation, being one of the top teams in the league year after year, at least for the last 4 years that he was there in New Orleans. And so the cynical person, and you guys know I'm known to be cynical, the cynical person could easily make the argument, that the reason why Arthur Smith and Terry Fontenot were hired was to run it back. And so that also leads me to believe that he's not going to show the same level of patience that, like this is a true rebuild. I don't really buy that. Like I feel like there's going to have to be, something to show for it. Again, whether that's them making the playoffs or not, but like they got to be at the very least very close to it. Like I just can't imagine Arthur Blank's enjoying seeing an empty stadium each and every Sunday because no one is excited about this team. You know what I'm saying? Like if they miss the playoffs, but like they're like the 3rd best offense in the league because they're putting up points and putting butts in the seats, like that would be a different conversation. But if we're looking at an awful offense and they're not putting butts in the seats, like I don't see how he'd be like, yeah, you know what? Like let's just keep this. Like I don't see it, but we'll see how it all plays out. Again, I don't know the answers, and we could be singing a very different tune 6 months from now, heading into the season, and certainly 9 months from now, seeing how that season starts to play out. So again, I'm not writing off the possibility that the Falcons come out and be very successful, despite sort of expressing some negativity on today's episode. I'm not writing off those things. I'm just sitting here saying like we need to see it. The clock is ticking is basically what I'm getting at. But the clock is ticking on today's Locked On Falcons, and we will wrap up today's episode with me pushing back against the pushback, as I often get here on the podcast, talking about people spending too much time worrying about the Falcons' first round pick, and also talk about whether some of these possible options for the Falcons at 8 could be reaches. But before we get into that, guys, I do want to let you know about the Locked On NFL podcast, which is free and available on all the same podcast platforms that you can find Locked On Falcons, including on YouTube. So make sure you head over to YouTube and subscribe to Locked On NFL so you can get the latest updates and info on all the ongoing things going on currently in the NFL. So, now that we're in a new year and we're, almost 2 months up in a new year, a lot of people have given up on their New Year's resolutions. And if your New Year's resolution was trying to eat healthier, it can be tough because, I've been on diets before. I know what it's like. You get tired. I know my biggest struggle with diets is eating, lack of variety in your food because you don't get to eat the same things that you want to eat oftentimes. And the way that you can kind of fix that problem, if you are also running into that, and eat something that tastes good but is also good for you, is with a Built Bar, the best tasting protein bar on the market. Built Bar is the protein bar that tastes just like a candy bar, even better than a candy bar. All Built Bars are covered with 100% real chocolate, but they're healthy for you. They're low in sugar, low in calories, low in carbs, high in protein, high in fiber. They come in a variety of flavors. You can get tried and trues like coconut almond, peanut butter brownie, cookies and cream, but you also have the toffee almond flavor, which is back for a limited time. So head over to built.com and buy that. There's other flavors like mint marshmallow, strawberry, churro puff, banana cream pie, white chocolate, cookies and cream, and so much more. So go to built.com, and when you do, use the promo code locked15 and you get 15% off your order. That's promo code locked15 for 15% off at built.com. So our last two questions, I will sort of try to double dip on these. One comes from Jay Carson at Jay Carson 156, and he says, "Good episode," referring to the Mock Draft Monday episode, "but I wish people would stop trying to tell fans that they are spending too much time worrying about the first round pick at this time of year. It's fun and the only good thing about finishing with a poor record the previous year." And Ryan Doyle left a YouTube comment saying, "Hey, Aaron, knowing we need an edge so bad, what are your thoughts on reaching a little for the likes of David Ojabo or George Karlaftis, even with the likes of Hamilton, Stingley, Gardner, or the wide receivers still on the board?" So I will double dip on this question. Jay Carson, you are correct. I shouldn't tell fans what they should be doing. And, today will be the last day, or I won't make any promises, but I will do my best to let this go right after today. As for Ryan's questions, my thoughts are kind of the same as they were for previously similar questions. If the Falcons reach on David Ojabo or George Karlaftis, then so be it. If that's considered a reach, but whether that's going to be considered a reach by the end of this draft cycle, remains to be seen, right? Because the last time the Falcons were said to have reached on a player was AJ Terrell 2 years ago, and now in his second year, he's one of the best cornerbacks in the league. Is that really a reach? You go back to Chris Lindstrom, the year before that, people thought that was a reach, but he was arguably a top 5 offensive guard in the NFL. One of the few bright spots on what was a pretty awful offensive line, and made Robert Mays' All-Pro team this past year. Was that a reach? Drafting an All-Pro guard in the middle of the first round? I don't know. And so, like, for me, part of why I push back against this whole notion of quote unquote obsessing with the first round pick is, there's this process, right, that goes on throughout this off season. And like, this process kind of needs to play out, and it depends. We go through the All-Star games, we go through the combine, we go through free agency, we go to pro days, and NFL teams won't really finalize their draft boards until mid-April. And so all the energy that I think fans put in, now in late February, talking about like what the team should do, I just think it's just sort of preempting that process. The way I kind of look at it is like, to me, it's like asking someone in week 6 of the regular season who's going to win the Super Bowl. It's like, I don't know who's going to win the Super Bowl. There's a regular season that has to play out. There's a postseason that has to play out. And so, this time last year, most people looked at the idea of drafting Kyle Pitts as a terrible decision. It was very unpopular at this point in time. Before that, the idea of taking a cornerback, in late February, there was some talk about it, but for the most part, most people's attention, certainly Falcon fans' attention, was mostly focused on the edge rushers, right? Which edge rusher would the Falcons take? And then guess what happened? The Falcons signed a free agent, in part due to they didn't love the edge rush class in 2020, signed Dante Fowler, and then cut Desmond Trufant. All of a sudden, cornerback jumped to the top of their list of needs. And then you go back to 2019 again, this time, February 2019, you go to look at the various mock drafts. Most of them had Ed Oliver, Christian Wilkins, or DeAndre Baker as the Falcons pick 3 years ago. And, then the question that someone like Ryan would have asked, like, do you think it makes sense for the Falcons to reach a little bit to take someone like a Dalton Reisner or Chris Lindstrom? And the answer, if you would ask me, like, Chris Lindstrom, no, that's a reach. Don't take that. The answer was AJ Terrell a reach. Yeah, he's a reach. You mean that guy that got cooked by Jamar Chase in the national championship game? Yeah, he was terrible. He'd be a major reach in the first round. But ultimately, that didn't prove to be true. And again, I promise I'll stop ranting about this, but I think there's a lesson in that. And it's a lesson that I think a lot of people refuse to learn. I think ultimately whether a draft pick is good or not will only be determined once the player is actually in the league and plays. Right? No one considers Chris Lindstrom or AJ Terrell to be reaches today, do they? Right? And, for me at least, I just think all the energy that people put in worrying about this guy or that guy, or is this guy a good pick, or is this the right pick, or whatever the case, ahead of the draft, just kind of winds up being a lot of wasted energy. That ultimately, at the end of the day, the Falcons going to pick who they're going to pick. And you're either going to like the pick or not like the pick. But ultimately, that doesn't matter because we're all going to sit here and root for the guy to be successful here in Atlanta. And so, like, to me, again, I'm not sitting here saying you're not allowed to have an opinion. I just kind of think, you can just kind of relax and let the process play out. Let the combine play out. Let the free agency play out. Let's see what needs the Falcons fill. Let's see where teams are on these prospects. That some of these players that seem like reaches today may not seem like a reach in 2 months. And so, like, that's my advice. It's just like, relax, be patient, and let the process play out, and we'll see how it goes. Again, sorry, Ryan, for not necessarily answering your question, but, like, I don't really know if David Ojabo and George Karlaftis are reaches at 8. If they wind up having 12 sacks 2 years from now, does it really matter? If it's, like, that's kind of the point I'm trying to make. And again, I'll let it go. We won't be talking about it anymore. I just kind of think just way too much energy spent that is kind of just retroactively just looks like a waste of time. Because, like, this time last year we were like, can Penny Sewell play guard for us? And it's like, again, there's nothing wrong with talking about it. There's nothing wrong with having an opinion on that, but just like all the time and energy that was spent arguing and debating it and whatever the case may be, like, none of that mattered. The Falcons didn't draft Penny Sewell, and he went to Detroit, and it was a right tackle or left tackle. That was it. None of that mattered. But obviously, I'm on an island with that opinion, so I'm letting it go. I'm letting it go. So that will do it on that. Again, sorry, Ryan, if I didn't quite answer the question to the degree that you wanted to answer. David Ojabo and George Karlaftis, my opinions on the players, they're both good. I wouldn't be upset if the Falcons drafted them, but again, I wouldn't put all my eggs in them being the guys that solve our pass rush needs, at least not in 2022. Now, again, like Thibodeaux, 2023, 2024, with development and time, sure, they could be the solutions to our problems, and we could be looking at those guys like we look at Chris Lindstrom and Kyle Pitts and AJ Terrell as top 5 players at their respective positions in 2 or 3 years. We could absolutely do that, but time will tell. So I don't have a definitive answer for you. So sorry about that. And again, I'll let it go. We're not going to talk about it anymore. So if you ask me my opinion about this player at pick 8 or pick whatever, I will do my best to answer the question without lecturing you on telling you not to worry about it. So that will be the end of it this offseason. So appreciate you guys for tuning in. If you want to send in listener questions for future Q&As, you can do so by hitting me up on Twitter or Facebook at Locked On Falcons, via email at lockedonfalcons@mail.com, or of course you can leave a comment just like Ryan did on the Locked On Falcons YouTube channel. Make sure you subscribe to Locked On Falcons when you do. Tomorrow's episode, we should have a guest, and we'll start talking a little bit more about the combine and draft and get that person's thoughts on some of the prospects. And that person, I'm sure, unlike me, will be able to provide potentially his opinion on some of the guys that he thinks the Falcons would make good choices at for pick 8 or whatever the case may be. So I would just basically, I guess I just have to bring on guests to answer those questions for you guys in the future. So we'll kick the tires on that on tomorrow's episode. And as always, want to thank you guys for giving Locked On Falcons your first listen of the day, and I always have recommendations for what your second listen should be. Why not check out Locked On Braves, see what's going on with my cousin Freddie? I'm sorry, that side of the family doesn't really talk to me all that much, so I don't have any insight into that. But Locked On Braves has insight into the latest rumors surrounding Freddie Freeman's future in the Major League Baseball and potentially with the Atlanta Braves. So go check out Locked On Braves, all on the same podcast platforms that you can find Locked On Falcons, including on YouTube. You can also find Locked On Hawks, Locked On Bulldogs as well on all those same podcast platforms, including YouTube. And of course, you can also find the Locked On NFL Draft podcast. Ryan Tracy and Eric Crocker are giving you the lowdown each and every day, answering those draft-related questions that I refuse to answer here on the Locked On Falcons podcast. So make sure you subscribe to Locked On NFL Draft to get those answers. This stubborn idiot named Aaron Freeman, who soon to be the former host of the Locked On Falcons podcast, will refuse to answer, and we'll get him off of here and maybe get somebody on here that will answer these questions. And yes, I'm going to keep bringing up that petition all the time because it's hilarious to me. So that, guys, will do it. Hopefully you sign that petition. Get me out of here. Until then.